everyone, welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The United States has implemented a new policy on visa applications. According to this, all applicants must submit their social media accounts that they have used in the past 5 years. This, in return, will connect the immigration office to all other data, such as their posts, photos, and contacts. The move is expected to impact some 15 million people a year applying for U.S. visas. In the past, there were also some reports that the U.S. visa centers were already monitoring social media accounts of their applicants. On tonight's show, we will try to find out how this new policy will help the U.S. bolster its immigration screening and how this should alarm social media users to be extra careful with their online activity. We welcome to the show to discuss this with us Mr. Klaus Jurgens, who is an analyst joining us from Vienna. We're also joined by Mr. Raphael Camisao, who's a researcher joining us from Brazil. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Jurgens, let me begin with you. How do you take this move of using social media to screen visa applicants? What are your thoughts about it?
Now, when I heard the news, I was rather surprised, to be honest. I know that for some time, if you have an electronic system travel authorization, the so-called ESTA, which is one kind of visa waiver system for many nations, not too many, but in particular Europeans, there was always a kind of two-class system. Now, on this application form, you had a voluntary option to state your social media accounts, should you wish so. It was never mandatory. Now, what I understand with the new system, everyone but the ESTA applicants, the visa waiver applicants, as you mentioned, some 15 million, will have to tell their Twitter history, their Facebook history over a period of 5 years. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
Now, I would say this is one step far too much. Now, we all use social media. We are now connected via satellite and Skype. I'm sure you and me today and my esteemed colleague will tweet. We will have chats on Facebook. We need to be online. Now, at some point, perhaps we would say something critical, nothing derogatory, but just a comment about a policy-making issue, a comment about a person, a comment about a politician all around the world, perhaps. And this would be stored, it is stored anyhow, but this would be then become a kind of personal profile. Has this person ever said something critical about anything? I think this is very, very dangerous. First of all, shall we stop using social media? No. Secondly, do we control or censor ourselves? I think it opens the door to a kind of Big Brother system. I am not entirely sure it will prevent terrorism. In the worst case, it could stop bona fide tourists and visitors to simply go to the United States because they say, no, I don't want to disclose all this information. I'm not entirely certain it is the right approach.
Right. And you've definitely pointed out how this is a very step in the screening process. And with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Camisao, how do you see this extreme screening process infringing upon the very rights that our earlier guests talked about, how they will curtail rights to freedom of expression and how they will get people to impose greater self-censorship upon themselves?
Well, the way I see it, the legality of this matter is extremely complex. Well, in one hand, the United States does have a right to limit the entrance of people in their territory, yes. But, well, people all around the world, as Mr. Jurgens said, they now have to worry whether their expression will be misconstrued by a foreign government official. This is an international suppression. Even though freedom of expression through visa regulation is not what in international law we would call just cogence, which is a compelling law, we cannot pretend that a state as powerful as the United States doesn't have this power to suppress freedom of expression. And also, this doesn't stay in the mere realm of, let us say, abstract rights. This will even suppress the civil rights of American citizens, because even we as foreigners to the United States, we have contact with American citizens through the internet. And these citizens, they will also have to regulate their speech when communicating with us. And even naturalized immigrants, according to previous decisions of the Department of Defense, they also have background checks in social media involved in the recent measures. So there are civil rights, there are barely legal civil rights violations involved.
Right. And thank you so much for providing us with that legal perspective, Mr. Raphael Camisao, and thank you for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Jurgens, back to you. Now, given the context and the rhetoric that is widespread in the United States right now against migration, against immigration, and what Trump continuously spews out against migrants, how do you see this measure aligning with all that? And do you think that this is a measure taken to deter people from coming into the United States?
First of all, credit where credit is due. And I think that the underlying reason actually has one positive dimension. We have a gun problem, for example, in the United States. We have shootings in the United States and in other countries. Afterwards, very often a social media profile is found, and then all of a sudden society is shocked. How could we not know about that this was a psychopath who simply wanted to go on a rampage? He posted it days before on social media. So there is one positive dimension to all of this. Social media should not become, as it is in some ways,
but Mr. Jurgens, just on that point, sorry to interrupt, but the majority of the mass shootings that have taken place in the United States were by U.S. citizens. This is about migration, trying to filter people out coming from outside. And I get the point that this might be to filter out extremists, but how likely is it for someone who has that agenda to publicize it on social media? Is there more to this, more to implementing this policy than just vetting out extremists?
No, this is exactly the point. We should not allow some dark sheep, some dangerous people to ruin the freedom of expression, as my esteemed colleague said, and the legal right to have freedom of expression. This is, I want to come back to my initial point. If you want to limit migration, if you want to limit immigration, the way to check a social media profile, as far as I'm concerned, is not the right way to do so. We have a similar debate now here in parts of Europe. What would we need? Should there be a cap or should there not be a cap? But we must clearly distinguish freedom of expression, in particular in a wonderful country like the United States, should always be guaranteed. Freedom of expression, freedom and the right to assembly. Now, President Trump just touched down in the United Kingdom yesterday. And before he touched down, he went online. He's a very regular tweeter. And there was a bitter exchange of words between the mayor of London, Mr. Sadiq Khan, and President Donald Trump. Now, the British foreign minister said upon Donald Trump walking down the stairs a little bit later, he said he would not expect that the London mayor would at any time soon be invited for a gala dinner in the White House because of a number of tweets. But were these tweets really an act of criminal offense? Of course not. But people talk about it. They will be on the record. Now, Perhaps I would, in a midnight move, one time make a comment like this, and this would be on my record, and I would be denied entry to the United States. Now, this would be taking a very serious subject far too lightly. I think the United States should stay open for migration. It is the American dream which makes that country great. And I think multiculturalism and a certain amount, even a high level of migration, is positive. And this whole debate about social media and putting it on record, as I said, I'm not entirely.
And Mr. Jurgens, hold on to that point while I introduce another guest who's joined, Mr. Patrick Henningsen, who's the executive editor of 21st Century Wire, joining us from London. Thank you so much, Mr. Patrick, for joining us. Now, this new policy is seen to align with Trump's vast policies regarding surveillance of migrants and to bolster the immigration process in a hardline manner. So how do you see this new policy under Trump providing more and more surveillance for the Security Department? And do you think that this will mean more surveillance for those people who are applying to the United States?
I think the one important thing that we need to be concerned with here is if you look at all of the sort of security rollouts that have taken place after 9/11, particularly, the United States is at the forefront of this sort of global security rollout, and it's a very, very easy and to slide into authoritarianism globally. And I think if you look at some of the measures that have taken place, initially this has been to supposedly stop terrorism under the guise of the war on terror. I'm talking about the sort of the rollout of body scanners, for instance, and you look at also data collection and data slurping, as they call it. And so the real question is, there's two questions. One is the question of legality. This is a big issue in the United States. There's pushback and there's multiple court cases right now with civil liberties groups because this is a clear violation of the United States Fourth Amendment, that every person has a right to protection of their persons and things. So this is a challenge to the Fourth Amendment. But beyond that, it's, this idea of innocent until proven guilty, this seems to be suspended in the sort of realm of national security. So this is hugely problematic in terms of the immigration issue. We do have stories like border security copying phone text messages, analyzing them, finding out that they thought that a boyfriend of one U.S. citizen who was traveling, I believe, from the U.K., because he made a comment about their relationship, wanting to spend the rest of his life with his partner, they deemed him as a immigration risk and therefore banned him for life returning to the United States. So you have those sort of instances, which may seem unusual, but in the age of social media now and data collection, this isn't going to be done by border agents in the future. You have to understand, once the policies are in place, that the work will be handed over to AI. It will be handed over to an artificial intelligence or algorithm-based program, basically.
And what is the implications of that when companies that are supposed to assemble big data, they get all this information?
Well, this is a bigger question. If this is going to move from the border agent into some sort of centralized AI function, which is going to be run by maybe a private corporation or the U.S. government or the NSA or a collection of governments around the world. The Five Eyes countries certainly comes to mind: Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. In this sense. But if that's going to happen, then all data that's produced on social media, I'm talking about Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, other popular social media platforms, LinkedIn, this is going to be analyzed. And Silicon Valley companies have shown that they're quite willing in some cases to comply with requests from government. So there's a kind of a quid pro quo relationship between corporations and government. Government wants things from corporations. Corporations want deregulation and favorable business conditions from government.
Right.
So more often than not, we've seen the companies capitulate to demands from government. And that's something that should be very worrisome going forward when you look at policies like this.
Right. And do you think that this measure that has been taken could be more for the collection of big data and personal information that people voluntarily give, as opposed to curbing extremism?
Yes, I do. I do think so, because if you look at the statistics, okay, like just in the year of 2017, the U.S. Border Patrol seized, and I think something like 30,000 mobile phones and surveilled them, copied down the data, but that's only 1 in 13,000 visitors, let's say, passing through those border checkpoints at that time. But the policy is in place, and so what will happen is it's hard to determine what is the risk of a terrorist attack, what is the risk of someone being an immigration threat. And once the policy's in place, it then becomes automated, and
right.
that's so. I don't think it's not a choice, and you can argue about the nuance of it. But once the policy is in place, then it just becomes systematized, and once it becomes systematized, it will be global. It will be done through a global regime, through a collection of countries that all opt into some sort of arrangement. So right. That's the big danger.
And Mr. Patrick, hold on to that thought. That's a very important point that you've highlighted. And I do want Mr. Jurgens' comments on that as well. Do you think that this guise for security, for ensuring national security and protecting the borders could actually have corporate interests at the back end?
It is not entirely impossible. But my colleague just said, now once these data are stored somewhere, it might become global. And of course, there will be big business behind it. It cannot be done anymore by a border police, a border force. There must be technology behind it, and of course there will be cooperation behind it. And once this is going global, I'm even more worried. Now, I wanted to put another point very briefly. It is not only what we tweet or what we say online or what we write or what we talk about. By pure coincidence, we might retweet something. We might have someone on LinkedIn we didn't really approve of, but we have 10 contacts who have different approaches towards democracy, or in the worst case are a terrorist. Now, these are on our contact list. They will be somehow filtered out. Now we become the target, although we are basically no target. So
we're being penalized just for association with these individuals. Just for the association of having a network, we could be criminalized, or we could be blacklisted, or we could not be allowed entrance into the United States.
Absolutely. And it is not only the United States. I heard about cases in Europe where immigrants or would-be asylum seekers had their mobile phones confiscated in order to find out, is this the real identity of the person? Because many people arrived, and most of them, I truly believe,
right.
out of dire situations, right. Huge catastrophes, and they wanted to find out who are these people, because they didn't bring any identity documents. Right. Now, you could argue, was this legal? Is it not legal? There are cases that say this is not legal. You cannot take away someone's mobile phone, where a private life on it, where is relations, family, children, maybe sorrow, maybe matters which are very dear to our hearts. So this goes into a direction of, right. I would say, a big brother approach.
Right. And Mr. Jurgens, you've definitely highlighted how this can information be used in many different ways. But on that legal aspect, I'd like to explore that a little more. And for that, we're joined by Ms. Ieva Miluna, who's an international lawyer, joining us from Riga. Thank you so much, Ms. Miluna, for joining us. Now, our earlier guests were talking about how when this information is taken at the border control, taken by the immigration officers, it could be then passed on to other companies, to other intelligence agencies, AI companies that could use this to analyze data of the information they've gathered. What is the legal aspect, the legal protections behind taking data from one office and giving it to the other? Once the State Department has it, is it up to their discretion to give it to whoever they want to?
Basically, all state offices are state organs. And from the perspective of international law, all state organs are responsible for human rights observation of individuals whose information has been gathered.
So with that, do you think that under the human rights obligation of protecting their citizens, privacy is one of the main things that they should keep in mind?
Yes, indeed. This concerns the right to private life and also the freedom of expression of individuals that for the posts that they post in their social media. Of course, there are counter arguments, and individuals in any case are responsible for the things that they post in the social media. At the same time, of course, each state has a legal interest to permit certain nationals to enter into their state's territory, and to permit only those nationals that do not pose any threat to security.
Right. So, of course, this information will be used for that intention, but as we were, it should be used for that intention, but as we were talking about it, it might not actually be the case that that's all this information is used for. Mr. Patrick, going back to you and talking a little more about the surveillance under Trump. There was an example in 2018 in which a Virginia-based intelligence firm used Facebook data and details of 600 protesters about family separation and gave it to the Department of Homeland Security. Now, these are intelligence firms using data, Facebook data about protesters and then giving it to Homeland Security. What is happening on that front? Is surveillance increasing? Has it become even more insidious under Trump?
What you're pointing out there is beyond surveillance, and it's beyond sort of looking at data or individuals who pose a risk in terms of terrorism or even immigration risk and so forth. What you're talking about there is the politicization of data, basically. And with this particular administration in the United States, we've seen a heavily politicization of certain issues, as you have with previous administrations politicizing other issues. This particular administration, the issue of the border obviously is hugely politicized, but it also has been for previous administrations. But at what point does the state desire to control security or to control its borders turn into kind of a paranoia regime? And what you have in terms of it's strictly on the immigration issue to apply for a visa in advance to the United States. The U.S. has the ability and will have the ability very soon through AI to fully profile everybody through an AI algorithm and weigh up their sort of risk in terms of security. So now with this ability, you can then extend this to the politicization of data. Are they critics of U.S. foreign policy? Does that put them in a higher risk category? It depends who's programming the matrix in which this data is being arranged and how they're prioritizing their threat assessment. Okay. Are they a critic of the state of Israel? Under this administration, that might have more weight in terms of being anti-American or posing some sort of a risk. Or so you can see the slippery slope in terms of the politicization of what people post on social media. It's turning this great tool of sharing, of community building that's been given to humanity through technology and has transformed it, has weaponized it, essentially, and turning it back against the population. And I think that's more prevalent than, and there's more of a risk of people's liberties being infringed on that basis than in terms of how many terrorists you're going to catch. Per se, or would-be terrorists. So it's very, very arbitrary, and it will become increasingly arbitrary the more these systems are automated.
Right. And on that point, Mr. Jurgens, while we're talking about this might being a cause of extracting information more than anything else, do you think other countries might follow suit in this war to gather as much as data as possible about users, about the population in general?
There is a danger, of course. We do have a debate, I hinted at, in Europe at the same time. What is the legal right to freedom of expression, and how can it be guaranteed by a constitution? And at the same time, how can you defend your own country? And terrorism is unfortunately higher a topic here than probably illegal immigration. Now, I would not be surprised if this, what is perhaps called a model for some time, or a kind of test run, if this would really yield results, what the US administration has in mind, I would not actually be surprised if other countries follow suit, or at least try it. Now, I still hope that this can be avoided. Cynics would say whatever we say now, whatever I write later, whatever we talk about, is somehow stored online or in the cloud system or somehow perhaps even monitored anyhow. So the fact that online conversations can be monitored is nothing new. I am not sure whether it should be made mandatory to give away all these details someone else might perhaps already have. You know, I'm definitely a liberal person in this regard, and I definitely defend the right of the United States to defend its borders, certainly. So does the United Kingdom, so does Germany for that matter. But you must draw a clear line between protecting one's liberties, which make a country great, and giving away these liberties basically to computers, to machines. My colleagues said artificial intelligence might take over one day. So I think it will become a global issue very soon, as more countries might just feel tempted to try it, to do another test run. I still hope it could be avoided. Here in Europe, perhaps the European Parliament could have a say about it. In other parts of the world, perhaps the respective national parliaments. And perhaps even in the United States, a debate could now start to say, how much freedom of expression do we really want to keep? Is the internet dangerous? Do we have to keep all this data for 5 years? And do we have to force people to disclose it? And let me add one point, perhaps if I make 10 seconds or 20 seconds. What would happen if other countries install similar systems for United States citizens asking for a visa? How would be the reaction?
And Mr. Jurgens, you've correctly pointed out and highlighted how this will start rolling a debate about the freedom of expression. To what extent you want to protect it? This debate regarding how much freedom of expression should be allowed on social media has already started, and many global leaders have been involved in it. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Klaus Jurgens, for talking to us and shedding light on this issue. Ms. Miluna, last question to you. While we're talking about this international debate in curtailing certain freedom of expression rights for people on social media, on other platforms, what do international conventions say?
The main instrument here is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So basically, and all human rights instruments as part of customary international law. So they basically set the norm that there is a freedom of expression, the right to private life, and all other human rights. And of course, this is the instrument that is binding on the United States. And also the United States need to observe this freedom of expression that is known worldwide. At the same time, I think that people should be more aware for the things that they post on the internet, because this is a public domain. And by posting certain posts in the public domain, they should be well aware that, of course, states have certain policies and they may have a certain legal interest to enter only those nationals that do not pose any threats to any security concerns of, in this case, particular the United States. So in this case, I think that Trump's administration's proposal is worthwhile to think about, and I think it's very good initiative.
All right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Ieva Miluna, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to debate further whether this move by Trump is in fact for the betterment or it's just going to infringe on people's rights further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Dr. David Lowe, who is a civil liberties expert joining us from Liverpool. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe, for joining us. Now, while talking about this U.S. Policy of vetting people through their use of social media, let me ask you, when people choose to put material on social media, are they giving up their right to privacy by entering into that public domain? Or are they still entitled to some sort of privacy and some sort of limits in which they can protect the information they put on social media?
Yeah, I think it depends which social media that you're on. Certainly if you're on the likes of Twitter and Facebook or LinkedIn, etc., that is in the public domain, and you've expressed views or you've posted certain issues that you want the public to know about. And I think, you have to look at it that way, that, when you look at certain agencies, then they would have the right to have a look at it, I think. But once you start to look at other aspects of communication, which is more private, I think that's the area of concern.
Right. And we've been talking a lot about how this policy will be impacting the government at the back end. But what about the 15 million people who are supposed to apply for U.S. visas? How do you think this new policy will impact them?
Well, I think an area of concern for me is, while I understand why many states would want to check out your communications, certainly your social media, and certainly those where there may be individuals on certain lists that are posed as a threat, either be it terrorism or criminal activity. I think doing it in a blanket way, and certainly with the current administration that we've seen in the US over the last couple of years, from other policies, if we link it into that, this seems to me more of a discriminatory type policy, which gives me cause concern. I mean, the US does have the capability with its various agencies, from the National Security Agency and like the Border Control as part of Homeland Defense, Homeland Security.
Right.
So I can see their capability, but, I have some concerns about this.
Right. And Mr. Patrick, on that point of discrimination and using this information to profile individuals in a certain way, what more can you add to that discussion here?
Well, I think there is cause for concern there. Just if you look at how U.S. Border Patrol are administering, let's say, the cloning of devices in downloading people's data for analysis, some sort of search procedure. This has actually gone up to the Supreme Court, and there's a number of cases being heard. And coincidentally, many of these cases are Muslims and people of color who have been profiled. So clearly there is some level of profiling there. And so I would expect the same, especially with this administration, who has instituted a Muslim ban, as it's called, but specific countries, which happen to be Muslim countries, and sort of restricting access and travel to the United States from those countries. So that's already kind of an overarching concern already. When you add the data harvesting and the data analysis aspect to it, then it's going to become, like I said before, more systematized. But more than that, I think if you look at once these policies are in place, and clearly there are these policies coming into place, this is a grave concern. Certainly, civil liberties groups and human rights groups around the country will want to push back against that. One would hope so. Right. But what it will do is create a chilling effect where people will be policing their own speech. So if you're planning a holiday to America, you'll be wiping your social media accounts. You'll be making sure you don't say anything too controversial, much like people do now, knowing that employers are reading their Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts. And so that is another aspect to this, a wider aspect.
Right. And when people might delete their social media footprint altogether, would that cause more concern, more suspicion for the authorities? Because these days it's very rare for someone not to have a social media trail at all. In that case, what do you think would happen?
Certainly that's an option for some people. So what you have is governments effectively carrying out a program of social engineering without actually having to put their finger on anybody physically. It's just done through policy. It's done through intimidation. It's done through sort of overarching policies that exist like this. So it would create a chilling effect. Certainly, this has been the case within countries where governments have taken a more aggressive approach, let's say, on censorship, or in countries where political speech is much more restricted than other countries. I think you can expand this internationally now if this is going to determine whether you get access to countries or not as a visitor or a traveler.
Right. And Mr. Patrick, hold on to that. We're also joined by Mr. Adam Khaze, who's an immigration expert joining us from Sydney. Thank you so much, Mr. Adam, for joining us. Now, we've been talking about this complex vetting process of actually including social media information in the immigration application and then going through it. this might impact almost 15 million users. But on this process of actually going through this information, is it practically possible on the logistical end?
Right. Well, from examples I can draw from Australia, I see it every day. It's actually used a lot in Australia, but it's done indirectly. So it's not as direct as what has happened in the United States. What I've seen in my own applicants, is applicants applying for refugee visas, for example, the government will access social media records and request social media records to see how active they've been. Now, that could benefit an applicant because you could almost stage a social media following, let's say if you're a part of a particular group. For partner visa applications, social media is very important, and that's used by the Department of Immigration and Home Affairs in Australia to see if an applicant is a genuine in a relationship. But what is of interest is what would happen at airports. You may have situations now where people submit applications and submit the social media content. However, that may not be reviewed until the applicant's at the airport. In Australia, I recently had a client that was held because he'd lodged a partner visa offshore, and they went through his phone, his WhatsApp messages, his social media accounts to see if the applicant had records of being with that partner and if it was all legitimate and if it was all, and they'll put on the spot without judicial review with cancellation provisions. So these type of provisions used in conjunction with automatic cancellation provisions available to governments, for example, in Australia at airports, don't have the judicial review process that one would like, and they can be, in a lot of cases, there could be a miscarriage of justice where a visa officer reviews a social media record, cancels a visa, denies entry on the spot, the person's sent back home. By the time it's even reviewed, the job offer or whatever reason they came to that country is no longer relevant. So it is practical, it can be used, but the danger is that in many instances it can be used and selectively used for other purposes, and I can't see in the legislation, which I haven't reviewed, I can't see what protections are in place for people who may suffer the negative consequences and what this information can be used for.
Right. So there's no way to challenge the decision that's made, and this process just becomes more and more arbitrary for the immigration office. On their whims, they can decide who to let in and who not to let in from a vast majority of social media posts that users put out. Is that the case?
Yes, I believe so. And then it could lead to a situation where it could have a lot of political influence, depending on the government that's in play. And I think this started essentially in 2001 when social media wasn't apparent with the Patriot Act, and then it set the scene in 2017 with the changes that Trump made under the executive order in protecting the nation. And basically what it allows it to do is there's nothing stopping a government at the time to say, okay, we're going to focus on left-wing, or we're going to focus on Muslim migrants, but we're not going to focus on right-wing migrants. We're going to vet these certain people. And then they can essentially manipulate the type of people they want in the country based on non-objective criteria that suits their political purpose at the time. And they could use that as almost a weapon, a social weapon, to prevent logistics of certain people into the country.
And Mr. Adam, just another question. If someone has already been given a visa, is there any way they can be denied entry into a country once they have gone through the proper process of attaining that visa?
Definitely. For example, in Australia specifically, we've had clients that have been approved tourist visas, arrived in Australia, and in a specific case, the applicant was from Brazil. The case officer found that the applicant in question had videotapes of child abuse, which was linked to their research and study. The applicant was put in detention and deported, on the spot, visa cancelled because the case officer deemed that to be illicit material, regardless of what the purpose was. We've got other cases where SMS messages were used to cancel visas on the spot because of a tourist visa, an applicant who came on a tourist visa that may imply that the applicant is working in the country. And therefore, it is a lot of power with the decision maker, and a lot of times these people are unqualified and not educated in the area to make such decisions.
Right. Dr. David Lowe, in light of that we've discussed regarding this case, and also about how surveillance is increasing, how do you see that curtailing civil liberties today in the world?
Well, I think what Adam was saying there was quite right. I dread to think what my electronic footprint's like. I sort of research terrorism and security and criminal law. And obviously things that I look at, but that's for my research. And I think he's quite right. It's how it can be interpreted. I think what's important is, I mean, you sort of look at this particular policy, obviously we're talking about the United States, but if you look at it from a global aspect, if it's looking at individuals from all aspects of extremism who can pose a threat, and don't forget we've seen this globally with extreme right-wing activists who communicate, although they may be nationalist in nature, they communicate globally and support each other. And
Right.
it's getting that balance between what's political, legitimate political commentary and what's extremism and poses a threat. I think it's getting that balance right. And I think you look at these companies like Twitter, Facebook, and so on. This is a problem that goes at an international level. Where do they draw the line before they suspend accounts? And they have been, to be fair to them, they have been suspending a number of accounts on various forms of extremism, from right-wing Islamists, and even here at home with the Irish Republicanism.
Right. And something that you mentioned here, Dr. Lowe, I'm going to ask Mr. Patrick regarding that where do you draw the line between legitimate political commentary and something that to be extreme? Recently, there was a case of Omar Barghouti, who is the co-founder of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, who was denied entry into the United States, even though he had a valid visa and he had traveled to the United States many times before. Do you think that with this policy, things are just becoming more apparent, but all of these mechanisms were working at the back end previously as well?
Well, in the case of the BDS person who you just mentioned, that's purely political. That's a case of the Israeli embassy in Washington communicating directly with the White House, or who then tells Homeland Security this person shall be denied entry to the United States for various reasons, and they can give any reason they want at the border. And that's really what it comes down to. All of these things can happen. Rights can be debated or observed, but when you actually get to the border, the people have, they don't have much of a choice. It's really up to that sort of interaction. And if you then turn around on a flight back to where you came from, there's maybe some protracted legal process that you might engage in, but for most people, that might not be economical. What we found in terms of security, when the body scanners came in, for instance, people will automatically comply. So you see 3-year-old children being forced to go and stand up with their hands up and be assumed to be guilty as a potential terrorist, or an elderly person who's in their 80s or 90s with a cane or a walking aid having to go through and being scanned. Just the kind of humiliation, the degradation of it. But people will comply because the need to travel trumps, in many people's eyes, what rights they might have presumed to have had. I've even witnessed U.S. The TSA, the Transport Security Agency, someone who's a quadriplegic, who's lost both arms and both legs, who's been taken aside and had his wooden legs and wooden arms scanned for explosives. And even though they knew him by name, because he'd traveled that route so many times, they still said we had to do this because it's just policy. It's just policy.
Right.
It's protocol. I'm sorry, So this is where the security state is.
Right.
Yeah.
And Patrick, thank you for that, and shedding light on the dark, bleak future there, and how people have to comply with these protocols, even though they might trump their civil liberties. Thank you so much, Mr. Patrick Henningsen, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Dr. Lowe, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Adam Khaze, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.